Chapter Null. The basement stairs creaked beneath my feet as I went down to do the laundry, but something hit me like a punch in the chest the moment my eyes landed on the wall opposite the washer. A door. There was a door where there had never been one before. The wall was supposed to be solid concrete, bare and unbroken. Instead, a dark wooden door with peeling black paint stood firmly in place, its rusty handle gleaming faintly under the dim basement light. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, and stared again, but it refused to disappear. I stepped closer, every instinct screaming that this was wrong, impossible. I had lived in this house for 4 years, cleaned every corner, and never once seen this door. The last time I was down here, just yesterday morning, the basement was its usual shape, empty, featureless, save for the laundry machines and a pile of old boxes in the corner. Now this door stood like a new wound in the wall. I reached out with shaking fingers and hesitated before grasping the handle, which was icy cold despite the warm air in the basement. My heart hammered as I pulled, expecting resistance or some trick of the hinges. To my shock, the door swung open with a slow creak that echoed through the silent basement. Darkness spilled out, swallowing the weak basement light like a black hole. A foul, damp smell seeped from the opening, thick and rotten, making my stomach churn. It was a scent I recognized. Decay. Death. I wanted to step back to slam the door shut and pretend none of this was real, but something at the edge of my mind pushed me forward. From inside the darkness, I caught a glimpse of stairs, descending steps covered in dirt and shadows that vanished beyond sight. I could not tell where they led, only that they went down, deeper than the basement, under the foundation of my house, into some place that should not exist. I swallowed hard and stepped closer, nerves screaming for me to turn away, but curiosity chained my feet. My phone was in my pocket, its little flashlight cutting a narrow beam into the black. I tried to see more, but the light barely reached past the first few steps. The air from the doorway was cold and stale, far colder than the basement had been just moments before, as if it came from below the earth itself. A sudden noise broke the silence, a dragging sound coming from within, like something scraping along stone steps or claws against concrete. I startled and dropped my flashlight, its weak beam spinning against the walls. The door slammed shut behind me with a clap that sounded final, trapping me in the basement again. The cold air vanished, but the door still stood there, locked solid with no latch or keyhole visible. I jumped back and tried to pry it open, but it didn't budge. Panic clawed at my throat, making it hard to breathe as I pressed my ear against the wood. Nothing, no sound, just the hollow thump of my own heartbeat. I ran up the stairs and threw open the basement door at the top. My hands shook so badly I struggled to turn on the lights. When the basement brightened, the new door was gone. Just the usual concrete wall, as if my mind had played a cruel trick. But the rotten smell lingered, faint but unmistakable, hanging heavy in the basement air. I retreated from the doorway, heart hammering, sweat cold on my skin. And then I noticed the deep gouges scratched into the floorboards, wet with something dark and sticky, leading straight to where the door had been. I knelt down, hand trembling, and touched the stains. They were fresh. I didn't want to admit it, but whatever that door was, whatever it hid, it had taken something with it. Something living or maybe dead, and it knew I had seen it. The night outside pressed against the windows like a watching silence. I could feel eyes in the shadows, waiting for me to open that impossible door again. Chapter Null. I kept the basement light on all night, but sleep avoided me like a shadow slipping away. Every sound upstairs seemed distant, fragile except in my mind where it grew loud and distorted. When morning came, I forced myself to go back downstairs, heart pounding against my ribs like a trapped animal. The wall was solid again. No door, no handle, nothing but cold gray concrete. I told myself it was a trick of tired eyes, stress playing cruel games. But the deep, fresh scratches on the floor remained dark and sticky. I knelt, fingertips tracing their jagged edges, and a chill traveled up my spine that had nothing to do with the cold basement air. Something was here, something that still breathed beneath my house. As the day dragged on, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Shadows seemed to stretch and twitch where they should not, and every creak and groan of the old house felt louder, sharper. When night draped itself over the neighborhood again, I went back to the basement, determined to prove to myself that the door was nothing real. Then I heard it. Faint whispering coming from somewhere behind the concrete wall. At first I couldn't make out the words, just a tangled murmur rising up from the darkness. I pressed my ear against the cold wall, heart hammering so hard I thought it might burst. The voices came clearer, pulling me inside themselves like cold fingers. "Help me!" The words were barely above breath, cracked and desperate. I stumbled back, hands shaking, breathing quick and shallow. Was my mind unraveling? I shut my eyes and took a deep breath, willing myself to listen again, to understand what no human should hear from inside a wall. Don't forget. The whispers were endless, overlapping, hot and close now, brushing past my skin like a cold wind. They spoke of pain, fear, and something waiting, something beneath the surface that did not want to be found. I tried to call out, but my voice died in my throat. Come down. Each phrase was a thread pulling tighter, dragging at every shred of sanity I had left. I knew the voices were not real, they could not be, but still they spoke. They breathed, they waited for me. I frantically searched the basement walls, tracing my fingers over every inch. And suddenly I felt it, a faint vibration like a heartbeat against the concrete. My hands trembled when I pressed deeper, a thin crack appearing beneath where the door had been. The voices grew louder, a chorus of agony rising from some endless dark. I ran upstairs, breathing hard, head pounding with the weight of what I'd heard. But the whispers followed me, echoing through the walls of the house, through the air in my lungs. I wanted to ignore them, to pretend they were nothing, but sleep never came. At dawn, I sat by the basement door, willing myself not to listen. Yet the voices never stopped, whispering their terrible secrets. And then I realized something worse. Somewhere deep beneath the surface, they were not only waiting, I was not alone. Chapter null. The next time the door appeared, I was ready in a way I never wanted to be. I found it again late that night, as if summoned by the whispers that had refused to leave me alone. Against every scream of reason, I gripped the icy handle and pulled. The door opened smoothly, revealing that same black maw of darkness. But this time, I didn't hesitate. I stepped through. At first, it was a narrow corridor, walls slick and cold, like something crawling beneath the earth. The air was thick and smelled of rot and wet stone. But something was wrong. Though the space looked cramped, I felt it stretching, growing around me like a living thing. The ceiling lifted out of sight, as if the corridor unraveled endlessly upward. I swung my flashlight beam wide, but the light vanished into a darkness that seemed to swallow the edges. I called out, voice trembling. The sound vanished instantly, as if swallowed whole. The corridor twisted and shifted. I spun around, trying to find the way back, but the wall behind me had melted into shadow, the door lost in the creeping black. Panic rose, but deeper than fear was a strange fascination, a pull that kept me moving forward. The floor beneath my feet changed texture, from rough stone to cold metal grids, then to something soft and pulsing like skin. My hand brushed against the wall, and it felt warm, almost alive, as if breathing slow and deep. The space bent and warped. In one direction, I glimpsed a room of endless mirrors, reflecting impossible angles that warped my image into twisted, monstrous versions of myself. In another, a vast hollow space stretched out, ceiling lost in shadow, floor vanishing into mist. The corridor was no corridor, but a shifting labyrinth that twisted beyond any logic. I tried to mark my path, scratching lines into the walls with a pocket knife, but the markings faded, replaced by fresh scratches like claws. The air thrummed with a low pulse that vibrated through my bones. Time seemed slippery here, seconds stretching into minutes, minutes folding back on themselves. I shouted for help, voice echoing and fracturing into many smaller whispers mocking me. The space seemed hungry, alive with something that watched and waited behind unseen doors and shadowed corners. Every step I took, the place twisted in response, folding in on itself like a nightmare spilling from some dark dream. Then I noticed it. Shapes at the edge of my flashlight's reach, moving just beyond sight. Flickers of figures blurred and twitching like distorted human forms trapped between worlds. They whispered again, calling softly, pulling me deeper into the labyrinth's maw. I tried to retreat, turning back toward where I had come, but the path was gone. The walls had shifted. The door I had entered through was nowhere to be found. Instead, a narrow tunnel stretched out ahead, lined with strange symbols carved in something like bone. My breath caught in my throat when I saw the floor writhe beneath me. The ground was not solid, but moved like water, shifting with shadowy faces that opened screaming mouths beneath the surface. I stumbled back, heart hammering, as the voices rose up louder, breathy, and demanding. I have no way out, I whispered to myself, voice cracking. The space was not just larger than the basement. This place was infinite, alive, and it had swallowed my home whole. A sudden cold slammed into me from behind. I spun, heart in my throat, to see the wall pulsing with light, veins glowing beneath rough stone. The living wall throbbed like a great beast breathing in the dark, its pulse matching mine painfully. And then in the far distance, a door appeared again, black and ancient but different this time. The handle turned slowly on its own, beckoning me forward into shadows deeper than night itself. As I stepped toward it, a whisper rasped behind me, low and cruel. "You belong here now." I froze, the space shifted beneath my feet, twisting tighter like a noose around my soul. Maybe that door was the way out, or maybe it was just another trap waiting to close. Chapter null. That night the basement was unbearable. When I opened the door at the bottom of the stairs, a wave of cold hit me harder than anything I'd felt before. The air was thick and heavy, swallowing the light and dragging warmth from my skin. Every step I took deeper into the basement felt like sinking into a freezing pool of blackness. I flipped on the light switch, but the bulbs dimmed, flickering weakly before fading into darkness. The only glow came from the weak beam of my flashlight, trembling in my hand. It barely cut through the shadow that seemed to gather like a living thing, pulsing and breathing in time with my racing heart. I wasn't alone down here. At first I thought it was just my imagination, the kind of paranoia that grows from sleepless nights and strange discoveries. But then the air shifted, the silence broke with a soft, deliberate breath that wasn't mine. The temperature dropped abruptly, frost gathering on the edges of the cement floor beneath my feet. I spun around, heart hammering, but saw nothing. No shapes, no figures, just the shadows thick and swallowing the edges of the room. Yet I felt eyes on me, an unseen gaze moving with a sentient hunger locking onto my fear, feeding off it. A pulse rippled through the air, thin at first, like a distant heartbeat. It matched my own, growing louder and faster as panic clawed through my chest. The basement walls seemed to shrink and stretch at once, bending subtly as if breathing alongside some invisible creature. Breathing became difficult, shallow. I tried to steady myself to call out, but the sound died in my throat, swallowed by the oppressive silence that closed in tighter the more I moved. The flashing light in my hand flickered erratically, often catching shadows at the corners of my vision that vanished the second I looked directly at them. I whispered to the dark, "I'm not afraid." But the temperature dropped again, colder than before, biting into my skin until I shivered uncontrollably. Then the room shifted once more, subtle but undeniable. The basement was alive, responsive. It was watching, waiting. I sank to my knees, breath fogging in the frigid air. The walls creaked softly, a low groan like the sigh of something trapped beneath the earth. My chest tightened as an overwhelming presence pressed down, crushing and inevitable. Suddenly, the basement lights flickered to life for a brief second, revealing fleeting glimpses of a form, tall, dark, featureless, standing just beyond the circle of light. I blinked, but when the glow returned fully, the figure was gone, replaced by empty shadows. My skin prickled. A whisper rippled through the air, not quite words, but tones laced with malice and despair. It wrapped around me like chains tightening, sinking with the terror that roared beneath my calm facade. "Leave," the voice breathed, not spoken but felt deep inside my mind. A warning, a threat. I clawed at the basement wall, desperate to find firm ground beneath the shifting sense of dread. The floor beneath me trembled, subtle at first, then like a pulse racing to a frantic beat. The cold grew unbearable, ice forming in sparse crystals along the edges of the steps. I realized the presence wasn't just aware of me. It thrived on my fear, shaping the darkness around me, bending reality to test my limits. My emotions echoed through the basement, feeding and stirring this invisible force until I was raw and trembling. Paralyzed, I felt tears cold on my cheeks, body shaking uncontrollably. The basement had become a living nightmare, something ancient and hungry reaching out for me in the dark. Suddenly, the temperature soared for a moment, pain searing through my skin like fire. The light in my hand exploded in a shower of sparks, plunging me into absolute black. I heard breath behind me, a ragged, wet exhale that was not mine. I dared not move. The basement whispered around me, alive and watchful, promising that I was not just a visitor here anymore. This space belonged to an unseen presence that now knew my name. And it was waiting. Chapter null. I tried to tell myself it was just my mind unraveling, a cruel trick of exhaustion and fear. But that night, the basement proved otherwise. As soon as I stepped below the floorboards and into that impossible darkness once more, the strangest, most terrifying thing happened. It knew. Not just that I was scared, Not just that I was alone, it knew what I was thinking. I hadn't spoken a word. The silence pressed against me like a heavy shroud. I gripped my flashlight tighter, expecting shadows to twist or shift, but the room remained still, too still. Then, out of nowhere, a cold voice, soft and hollow, echoed in my mind. Not spoken aloud, but like a word formed inside my very thoughts. "You're afraid." My breath caught in my throat. I looked around wildly, struggling to find the source, but the basement offered nothing but darkness and cold stone. I forced myself to calm down and tried to concentrate on my next thought. I need to leave. The voice came again, closer this time, sharper. "You cannot." My heart slammed against my chest. How could it know? I had thought those words silently, afraid even to speak. I swallowed hard and tried to focus on something else, anything else. I pictured light, safety, and warmth, willing that image to grow. "You think you're safe." That voice wasn't mere sound. It was an invasion. It seeped inside me, twisting dreams and memories until they felt like chains. The basement wasn't just alive. It was reading my mind, twisting my thoughts into its own language. I tried to flee, but the way I'd come was gone. Every step I took felt as though I were sinking deeper into a pool of cold, dark water. Panic rose, suffocating and absolute. I thought, why me? Because you saw. And because you cannot forget. The space whispered back secrets I hadn't spoken aloud. It spoke of things buried in the cracks of my soul, fears I had never named, regrets I tried to erase. It knew too much. My mind raced. Was the door some twisted mirror of my own consciousness? A living trap built from my deepest terrors? "You cannot hide." I staggered, clutching my head, as the basement walls mutated. Shadows morphed into faces, twisted, grinning reflections of my own fears, mocking me silently with eyes that burned like coals. The air vibrated, whispering names I hadn't heard in years, things I wasn't prepared to face. I tried to scream, but the sound caught, muffled and broken. The voice filled the silence in my brain like a poison dripping slowly, planting seeds of paranoia and dread. I thought I was alone. No, it was here, inside me, watching, waiting. I realized then that the door wasn't just an entrance or a passage. It was a conduit, a living, thinking part of this shifting nightmare. It reached into me, stripped away my defenses, and used my own mind against me. The basement cooled to an unnatural chill, every breath freezing in my lungs. Shadows pooled beneath the stairs, swirling and coalescing into vague shapes that whispered in perfect unison. They knew me. They knew everything. And as my thoughts spiraled into chaos, one final, terrible question burned through my mind unbidden. What if the door is not just a portal but a prisoner, and I am the key? Chapter null. I stopped answering calls. Messages piled up, ignored, unread. My friends began to drift away, their voices quiet and distant like echoes in another life. Even family noticed the change, how my eyes darkened, how my skin looked pale and drawn. But I couldn't explain the pressure crushing me from within, the cold grip that strangled my thoughts every time I thought about the door. It wasn't just a door anymore. It was a sickness eating away at me, a secret I wasn't allowed to share. Every time I looked at the basement stairs, fear curled around my gut like poisoned fingers, and yet I couldn't stay away. The whispers grew louder, bleeding into my thoughts during the day, snaking beneath my skin at night. One afternoon, a friend showed up unannounced. I found her standing uncertainly on the porch, concern written across her face. She asked if I was okay. I lied, said I was fine. The words tasted like ash when I spoke them. She didn't press too hard, but I saw the worry in her eyes fade with every visit unreturned, every excuse whispered over the phone. I stopped leaving the house altogether. The world beyond my walls became a blur, news stories, sunlight, laughter, all faded into forgotten noise. Inside my home, the basement called relentlessly. Each night the door would appear again, black and unyielding, promising secrets and horrors I was powerless to resist. I lost hours, sometimes entire nights, descending into that shifting space beneath the concrete, emerging hollow-eyed and broken. I stopped eating properly, lost weight without noticing. The thinness of my body did little to ease the weight crushing my spirit. My voice grew quieter, my responses slower, as if part of me was already trapped elsewhere. People stopped stopping by. The house grew too silent, save for the low thrum of that terrible presence lurking just below the floor. One evening, after a sleepless night spent packing and listening to whispers, I found a message scrawled on the basement wall. Not there before, not written in any language I recognized, but drawing itself in sharp lines of something dark and wet. I touched it. The cold seeped into my bones. The words pulsed inside my mind, echoing fears I hadn't dared to say out loud. "You cannot leave." I tried calling my sister. No answer, left a voicemail that choked in my throat. I tried texting a friend. Messages went unanswered. I tried to leave the house once, but the door jammed tight, as if the house itself refused to let me go. Sweat poured down my face as I pulled and pushed, but the locks held. Days, maybe weeks passed. Time became meaningless. I spoke less, I moved less. The isolation was complete. And in the deepest hours of the night, when I stared blankly at the basement door, I realized the truth. The door wasn't just trapping me. It was pulling me in, piece by piece, stealing my life until I belonged to that space entirely. And the worst part, I wasn't the only one. Because now, I could hear other whispers, faint and desperate, coming from behind that door. Calling for help. From people just like me, lost, alone, swallowed whole. And whatever waited behind that door, it wasn't finished yet. Chapter null. I stood before the basement door, its black surface swallowing the weak light from my flashlight like some endless void. The scratches on the floor, the whispers that clawed at my mind, the cold that seemed to seep into my bones, they all led here to this impossible threshold. I knew that once I crossed, I might never come back, but I had to know. The sickness inside me demanded it. My hands trembled, sweat slicking my palms as I gripped the handle. For a long, dreadful moment, I hesitated, breath hitching in my throat. Then, with a shuddering pull, the door swung open. Darkness poured out, thick and heavy, preceded by a foul, rancid breath that made me gag. The basement behind was gone. In its place lay a long, narrow corridor cloaked in shadows deeper than any night I'd known. The air was cold and wet, clinging to my skin in oppressive waves. I stepped inside. The floor beneath my feet was slick with something damp, uneven and shifting. My flashlight beam flickered, barely touching the walls that twisted and writhed as if alive. I swallowed hard, heart hammering like a trapped animal, and moved forward. With every step, the corridor stretched unnaturally, extending farther than any ordinary space could hold. The ceiling disappeared into a blackness so vast I felt like I was falling upward into the void. The walls pulsed softly, their surfaces moist and textured with strange patterns that writhed like veins beneath thin skin. I tried to call out, but my voice was swallowed instantly, crushed beneath a suffocating silence that pressed against my eardrums until I was lightheaded. Panic flared, but I forced my legs onward, drawn by an unseen pull deeper into the nightmare. Suddenly, the space twisted. The corridor folded back on itself in impossible geometries, angles bent where they shouldn't, stairways spiraled in directions that defied physics, and doors led into endless darkness or bright places that hurt my eyes. The world beyond the door was a surreal labyrinth, alive, watching, breathing with malice. I passed rooms filled with distorted reflections of myself, faces twisted in silent screams, shadows flickering where bodies should be. I saw glimpses of people trapped within the walls, faces pressed against unseen barriers, eyes wide with terror, mouths opening in silent pleas for help. A cold whisper brushed my ear, so close I could feel its breath. "Welcome home." I stumbled back, heart pounding, but the corridor shifted and closed behind me like a cage. The door I had come through vanished. I was inside, no way out. Light flickered around me. Shapes moved in the darkness, long, twisted forms that slid along the walls, creatures with eyes too bright and limbs too many. They watched me with cruel amusement, their hunger palpable. The floor rippled beneath my feet, becoming liquid shadow that pulled at my shoes, threatening to drag me beneath. I fought the urge to scream, to run, but the path ahead vanished into a murky abyss. The whispers grew louder, chanting words I could not understand but felt deep in my bones, a language older than time, full of promises and curses. I felt my mind fraying, edges blurring between what was real and what was nightmare. The house, the door, this endless dark, it was all one living thing, an ancient hunger feeding on fear and despair. And now I was inside its heart. A sudden chill seized me. Something brushed my shoulder, not cold flesh, but tendrils of shadow, probing and crawling like living smoke. Behind me, a voice, low and menacing, rasped inside my mind. "You cannot leave." I tried to turn, but the darkness pulled tighter around me, folding deeper into itself. The corridor stretched infinitely, a void with no exit, a prison without walls. I was swallowed whole, and in that endless black I understood. This place was not a door to anywhere. It was a doorway to everywhere. And I had just crossed the threshold. Chapter null. The moment I crossed that threshold, everything I thought I knew shattered like glass. The air around me rippled, heavy and viscous, as if reality itself had become a fragile illusion stretched thin over some unseen frame. The darkness that swallowed me was no mere absence of light. It was a living, breathing void that pulled at the edges of my mind, tugging threads loose until I was unspooled, unraveling. I stumbled forward, sensations warping beyond comprehension. Walls twisted into impossible shapes, floors dissolved beneath my feet to reveal infinite depths, and the ceiling spilled upward into a sky stitched from shadows and fragmented memories. Voices echoed, my own voice and others, speaking truths I wasn't certain I wanted to hear. I remembered something terrible. This basement, this house, the door itself, they were not anchored in the reality I believed I lived in. They were constructs, layers built over something else. A cage, thin as a veil but strong enough to hold me and countless others trapped inside. I was not who I thought I was. Faint images flashed across the darkness like broken film. Faces of people I barely recognized, but who lined my past, distorted events twisted in ways designed to distract and confuse me. The whispers morphed into words I understood, though they chilled me to the bone. You are a fragment, a shadow cast by a bigger truth, an echo of a self that never fully lived. Panic flared, threatening to consume me, but the void guided me deeper, showing me visions of a vast, cold expanse beyond this fragile cage. I saw others, lost souls suspended in spaces like mine, connected by threads weaker than spider silk yet impossible to sever. The house, the basement, even the door, they were lies, illusions forced upon me to keep me blind, to keep me safe and imprisoned at once. My memories, my fears, my identity, they were fabrications, carefully woven so I would never glimpse what lay beyond. I tried to scream, but the sound fractured and scattered, twisting into static that filled the endless dark. My thoughts fought to cling to something solid, something real, but every anchor slipped away. A terrible realization settled over me like frost. Reality itself was breaking down, folding in on itself until nothing was certain. Not time, not space, not even me. I saw a reflection flicker in the void. My face, but unfamiliar, cracked, and incomplete, fatting at the edges like a ghost stranded between worlds. "Who am I?" I whispered, voice barely there. "You are what remains," the void answered, "a remnant trapped between existence and oblivion." I wanted to turn away, to reject this truth, but the darkness embraced me, cold and merciless. Memories that weren't mine wove through me, places I'd never been, moments I'd never lived, fears I never had but now felt viscerally. The door in the basement wasn't a gateway. It was a wound, a tear in the fabric of what I thought was a solid world. I was trapped in something far older and darker than a haunted house or a lost basement door. I was a prisoner inside a dream, someone else's nightmare, and the dreamer was still awake. As the void whispered secrets I could barely comprehend, my last grip on certainty slipped away. The walls of my identity crumbled, and a vast, cold emptiness grew where the I should have been. And just as I felt myself dissolve into nothingness, the darkness spoke one final, haunting truth. There is no door, there was never a door. Only the trap. And then everything went silent. Chapter null. The darkness closed in around me, thick and suffocating, folding like a living shroud that twisted tighter with every desperate breath I took. The shifting space I had crossed into was no longer just a labyrinth or a prison. It was a living nightmare that breathed in my fear and exhaled despair. I understood now. There was no way back. I stumbled forward, the floor beneath me changing from cold stone to something slimy and soft, like rotting flesh. The walls rippled and pulsed, throbbing with an impossible slow heartbeat that matched the frantic pounding in my chest. I tried to call out, to scream, but my voice had been stolen, swallowed by the endless void that surrounded me. The corridors stretched and twisted, folding over themselves in impossible geometries. I ran, but with each desperate step the path rearranged itself. Doors appeared then vanished, Walls dissolved into yawning chasms, and shadows lunged from corners I swore had been empty moments before. This place was alive, and it toyed with me like a cruel predator stalking its prey. Whispers swirled like smoke in my ears, voices both distant and close, echoing the terror gnawing at my mind. They spoke in riddles and half-truths, teasing me with promises of escape that dissolved the second I reached out. Faces flickered in the darkness, twisted, silent masks staring with hollow eyes that burned into my soul. Fear bled into every part of me, blurring the line between nightmare and reality until I no longer knew what was real. My hands passed through walls that felt like mist. I fell endless depths only to find myself back where I had started, trapped in an infinite loop that shattered my sanity. Time lost meaning. Seconds stretched into eons. The cold pressed into my bones, the darkness carved itself into my flesh and mind. I was utterly alone, but the presence was everywhere, watching, waiting, feeding. A sudden gust of icy air brushed past me, carrying the faintest scent of decay and rot. I turned, but saw nothing but darkness. Then a low growl rumbled through the void, vibrating through the walls and floor. It was a sound not human, not animal, but something far older and crueler. I fell to my knees, gasping for breath that would not come, clutching at my skull as the whispers turned to screams. I saw flashes, brief, terrible visions of bodies twisted and broken, faces frozen in eternal fear, trapped like me in this endless maze. I tried to fight, to will the door back open, but the space denied me. The walls mocked me with impossible shifts, their surfaces alive and reeking of rot. Every thought I had was echoed back at me by the unseen tormentor dwelling here, exposing my deepest fears and wrapping them around my mind like chains. Despair settled deep inside me, a cold black hole swallowing all hope. And as the shadows crept closer, tendrils of darkness brushing my skin like icy fingers, a terrible realization broke through the haze. This place had already claimed me. There was no door. There was no basement. There was only the endless, living nightmare I now belonged to. And the whispering voices, cold and cruel, danced just beyond hearing, promising one final truth. You are home now, and you will never leave. Chapter null. The darkness never lifted. It pressed upon me like a weight, crushing every fragment of hope until all that remained was a hollow shell, drifting through a void that had no name and no mercy. The shifting space that swallowed me whole had become my prison and my world, one that twisted reality until it was unrecognizable, a cage fashioned from shadows and whispered lies. The cold was constant, seeping so deep into my bones that warmth felt like a forgotten dream. I felt my thoughts fray, unraveling thread by thread, as the presence that ruled this place wove its dark influence into every corner of my mind. It whispered in voices both familiar and alien, reciting secrets no living person should know, carving my fears into the fabric of my being. I no longer remembered how long I had been trapped, or even who I had once been. The edges of my identity blurred, fading like an old photograph left out in the rain. All that mattered was the endless, shifting nightmare that fed on my despair and shaped my very existence. One day, or what I thought was a day, the space coalesced around me, folding and folding until I stood before a door black, ancient, and impossibly huge. I knew instinctively this was the heart of the place, the source of its power, the final torment. I reached out, fingers trembling, and pressed my palm against its cold surface. The door responded, pulsating like a living thing hungry for my soul. The whispers rose into a deafening chorus, reciting my name, my fears, my sins, wrapping them around me like chains forged in shadows. Then the door opened. Inside was not light or freedom, but a vast emptiness. An abyss that swallowed sound and memory alike, a dark mirror reflecting the shattered pieces of my soul. The air was thick with silence that screamed, cold that burned, and despair that drowned. I stepped inside, falling into the void, knowing that there was no escape, no salvation. The space's power wrapped around me like a shroud, suffocating, endless, and absolute. It stripped away every hope, every dream, every memory of the life I once believed was mine. I was no longer a man trapped in a house. I was the house, the basement, the door, and the infinite, shifting nightmare itself. Alone, forever bound to a reality that existed only to trap and consume. And as the darkness closed in, swallowing me entirely, a final whisper echoed through the void. Welcome to eternity. And in that bleak end, I understood the truth. There was no way out because I had become the prison.